Good evening and welcome to our third webinar on aviation noise. My name is Dominique Lazarski and I chair a grassroots organization opposing Beauvais Airport's expansion in near Paris. I also chair Uecna, the European Union Against Aircraft Nuisance, which was created 53 years ago. Uecna is a non-profit NGO representing communities suffering from aircraft noise and air pollution at European level. Today's meeting is the last of our first series of webinars, and there will be a second series at the beginning of next year addressing subjects like metrics or community engagement. In between, we will hold our annual general meeting in Brussels and online on the 11th of December, and the afternoon subject will be on planning and organizing a campaign with speakers like John Stewart, whom you probably already know and who will be presented to you in a moment, and Florian Spurk, who led the campaign which stopped a new runway at Munich Airport. We will discuss the techniques and of successful campaigning, the need for a strategy, the challenges of bringing together a wide range of people, the need to be focused, and the tactics which work best. Noise is a strong concern for the population overflown, and in the past recent years and months, at many airports, we have seen the introduction of performance-based navigation, PBN. This led to considerable complaints, particularly in Canada and in the USA, from communities often newly and/or more heavily impacted by new flight paths. There could be losers, but also winners, as on the contrary, PBN can lead to relief for some communities. Deciding whether flights must be concentrated or not can be a difficult decision. Who should decide? This will be the discussion of today's webinar. We will try to address our concerns and fears of concentrated flight paths with our speakers. I will now pass the floor to Eleftheria Mfiezi, a public health expert living near Athens Airport and a member of Uecna's board. She is also a European Climate Pact ambassador in Greece. Eleftheria, can you now present the speakers of today's webinar?
Of course, thank you, Dominique, for this. Today, we have two speakers. The first one is Ian Jobson, who will be the lead speaker for this matter. He's well known internationally for his work for the United Nations body ICAO for the PBN, who is performance-based navigation rules. I'm sorry. No, you didn't hear me. Mr. or Mrs. Terry has his mic on. Maybe he can switch off or mute himself. Thank you.
Dominic, Eleftheria, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. I was saying that Ian Jobson is internationally known for his work in the United Nations body ICAO on PBN, which is performance-based navigation, routes and community engagement. Currently, he's the head of sustainable operations at NATS, which is the air traffic control in the UK. And after Ian, John Stewart will take the floor, who headed up HACAN, the community organization which gives voice to the residents under the Heathrow flight paths. He will outline the community engagement Heathrow Airport undertook for this matter. John has also written a book about why noise matters, and he's our vice president. Dominique will share the floor afterwards. She doesn't need an introduction. She's the soul of this effort, and our fight, and she's representing Uecna in all the bodies we participate. So the floor is to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and hello everybody. I was going to say good evening, but that would only be for my time zone. I realise there are people from all over the world, so whatever time of day it is, I hope you're having a good day. I have to admit, just at the start of this, whilst I've been working online, as many of us have for the last 18 or 19 months, I haven't worked with Zoom very much, so you're going to have to bear with me. I'm going to try and share my slides, but if it goes wrong, then please be forgiving me. I'm going to have a go now. So I think I need to share that one. Okay. Now, are you seeing the slide there?
Yes, perfect, Ian.
Splendid. Thank you very much. Well, hello everybody. Yes, and thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to just make a couple of clarifications in terms of how, so you understand what sort of questions I can answer towards the end of this. So I've spent around 25 years working in aviation environment issues. My first job actually was cycling around West London, interviewing people to understand how they felt about aircraft noise, and then collating that data and analysing that for the UK Civil Aviation Authority. And I've always stayed in the environmental side of aviation. So if you want to ask me very detailed questions on performance-based navigation, then I may well have to defer, take the questions away and come back to you, because that is not my area of expertise. And I think actually there's maybe an advantage in that. I hope I can speak in layperson terms about airspace modernisation and performance-based navigation as a result of not really being completely in the detail. So anyway, what I wanted to do is give you a bit of an overview of some work that I've been doing with the UN Body for Aviation, ICAO, based in Montreal, with a team of international team of experts on performance-based navigation and community engagement. Firstly, I'll cover a bit about that ICAO work, and then I also wanted to mention some work that the Airports Council International have done with CANSA, which is the global air navigation service provider, so Air Traffic Control Trade Association, on performance-based navigation. This is a space where there's quite a lot of work being done in the last few years. But before I do that, I just briefly wanted to touch on why PBN. And having put this list together, I'm going to start at the bottom actually. So performance-based navigation is part of the ICAO Global Air Navigation Plan. And just to explain, again, I hope in layperson's terms, performance-based navigation is rather like the switch that we made when we went from, if you remember, analog television and analog radio to digital television and digital radio. That gave us much better signal quality. It gave us much more accurate picture quality. It gave us much more bandwidth for many more channels. Actually, PBN is effectively doing the same thing. At the moment, the way we track aircraft and navigate aircraft is using ground-based navigational facilities. Actually, performance-based navigation uses much more digital, satellite-based technology, which allows the aircraft to be much more predictable in where they are in the sky. This and safety is at the top of this list for a very good reason, because I think the primary reason for this technology is actually to make aircraft in flight much more safe. It does improve capacity because you can get the aircraft much more predictably closer together, so you can get more aircraft through a particular piece of airspace. And I should note that this is actually, this list came from a paper that was produced as a result of the work that I was doing with ICAO. What we did find is, performance-based navigation does facilitate tailoring for noise improvement, and I think John maybe you'll talk about that a little bit later on. But there is obviously the potential there for concentration of noise, and that obviously needs to be considered. There are fuel efficiencies and flexibilities in routings that are implicit in this style of navigation. So you can imagine, if you don't have to route from beacon to beacon, from point to point, you can actually route in any particular direction. There's much more flexibility. I mentioned resilience. There is also the potential for noise respite. So PBN routes, I think, are much more that can facilitate switching on and switching off of routes for respite purposes, and that's potentially of importance for overflown communities. They produce better profiles, and actually from an air traffic control and pilot on the flight deck perspective, it's reduced workload, because once an aircraft is on a PBN route, then it's really a monitoring process rather than a control process, which is how it is when we're on traditional navigation. So just a little bit of background on why PBN, but basically all of those benefits come down to a diktat that ICAO have put out, which is the Global Air Navigation Plan. So the 180 odd states that sign up to ICAO are committed to that Global Air Navigation Plan, and effectively they will be implementing performance-based navigation in line with that Global Air Navigation Plan. So let's just get into a little bit of the background on the work that we've been doing in ICAO on PBN and community engagement. So this was tasked for, and bear with me because ICAO is quite a complex world. They have long names for things and then lots of acronyms. So ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. They have a Committee on Aviation Environment Protection called CAPE, and that Working Group 2 of CAPE is about airports and operations. And this task was allocated to Working Group 2 Airports and Operations Task Group. And the request was, this is a request from ICAO, from the states of ICAO, gather some information about performance-based navigation. What are the implementation challenges? What are the potential solutions for those? And including methods for cross-industry collaboration, and particularly for structured community engagement around performance-based navigation. So to be clear, this was a task that was requested by the states that contract to ICAO. They felt there was a need to understand these particular issues in a bit more detail. I took on this task within Working Group 2. I had more than 50 participants. Indeed, Dominique, you were a participant, I believe, in this task, and others. So more than 50 participants. The work was done mainly through teleconferences, but some face-to-face meetings. So I'd be on things like this at quite odd times of day, because these people are all around the world talking about this, gathering data, and I'll talk a bit more about the specific task. But actually at the core of the task, and I said that there was a global air navigation plan from ICAO, at the core of it was a review of no less than 99 ICAO performance-based navigation implementation plans. So these are 99 states that have put together their plan for PBN implementation. We needed to look at all of those and understand what sort of implementation were they doing, how are they engaging with communities. We also launched a survey to understand what states were doing around PBN and community engagement, and what the benefits they saw were. And we looked at some of the existing ICAO material on community engagement. We also did some case studies and a literature review. And this is what I'll mainly cover in the next few slides. This literature review and the work that we did to survey some of the states. The results of this work were published in 2019. So on the right there is the document that we published. You can get to that on the ICAO website. So what I'm going to, it's quite a long document and there's lots of information in there. So if you are interested in this, then I would suggest don't listen to me, and have a read of the main document, because there's a lot more information in there. There's a lot being written about performance-based navigation, given it is something that the ICAO has said that needs to be implemented globally. There's a lot being written about this. The likes of CANSO and the Federal Aviation Administration in the US, and a number of other bodies have written quite detailed documents about performance-based navigation and the role of community engagement in that. And actually, since this work was done in the 3 or 4 years running up to 2019, a number of further documents have been published, and I'll talk about those at the end of the presentation, give you a little bit more insight into those. And what did this literature review? What perspectives did it give us? Well, firstly, it said when you need to engage all stakeholders, in particular potentially overflown communities, really early in the process of making a change. Because what we found in those documents, that case studies were showing that opposition to change quite often came from a misunderstanding of what was trying to be achieved, or some misinformation about what PBN was, and within that start early education about PBN and about airspace modernisation was really important. Secondly, and probably quite obviously, just understand communities, understand the audiences you're trying to speak to, and then understand their requirements and see if PBN can make a space where you can make airspace designs work for the communities that are potentially overflown. And airports have a key role in here, this literature review told us. A key role because of their really detailed long history of working with communities and understanding the interests and the concerns of those communities, and utilising that knowledge is really important. Thirdly, all PBN implementations will be different. All airspace modernisation implementations will be different. So, for example, next week, we're in the UK, we're implementing an airspace modernisation right across the north of England and Scotland. A huge, but it's at 22,500 feet and above. Now, actually, in consultation terms, in impact terms, that has a relatively low impact. So that's one level of engagement you might need. But actually, you may have another airspace modernisation that takes into account the impacts on lots of different locations and actually at relatively low levels. So each case is different. Bear in mind when you're trying to communicate about that you will need to tailor your messages to the level of impact that you're likely to expect. A couple more perspectives from the literature review. Absolutely fundamentally important that you have an outreach plan, you have a community engagement plan. And again, going back to the last point, that needs to be tailored to the scope and scale of the PBN project to avoid misunderstanding. So if you're changing a single route at 36,000 feet, actually it's probably not worth going and speaking to thousands of people about it who won't actually be impacted. But if you're doing things where people are going to notice a change, then you need to be very clear and very broad with your community engagement plan, and absolutely build trust through transparency. Be really clear about what you're planning to do, how you're going to involve stakeholders, and bring them into the process. And finally, one of the things that we picked up a lot from the literature around performance-based navigation is sometimes you need to go beyond minimum requirements. So governments will set minimum requirements, or local authorities, or counties, or whatever, will set some local or national regulations. But sometimes you need to consider, do we need to go further than those statutory minimums? If you can understand those and understand potential impacts of the plans that you have, then you may consider that it's worthwhile going beyond those in order to take in the stakeholder requirements in the broadest possible way. Just a quick note on who responded to the survey that we put out. So a lot of aircraft operators, states themselves were responding. There was around 32 or 33 responses. Airports, you see there, procedure designers, NGOs, they were all responding. The vast majority, or the majority of the respondents by region were from Europe and North America. Europe, North Atlantic, North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, although we did still get some responses from Asia and Pacific, South America, and Eastern and South Africa. So reasonable coverage across the ICAO regions. Just one quick note, actually, I thought it was interesting to note when we asked in the survey, when you're doing a PBN implementation locally, are you required to do an environmental review or an environmental impact assessment? Actually, getting on half of the respondents said that they're not required to do an environmental assessment for a performance-based navigation type implementation, which actually really quite surprised me. Coming from a country where we're quite closely regulated on environmental performance, it was interesting to see that almost half the countries that were surveyed didn't have to do that. But actually then when we subsequently asked, are you intending to do an environmental review or impact assessment, more than half of the respondents said, yes, we are. So for me, that shows, well, people really understand that an environmental assessment or review of things like an airspace modernisation project is a really important thing to do, which I found quite heartening. In terms of other, I could run through lots and lots of bar graphs from the survey responses, but actually that would take us quite a long time, and you can see that in the document yourself. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in the specific responses, then please do look at those. But I wanted to bring out some of the keynotes from the survey. Firstly, it was very clear from the survey that actually success comes from providing communities with different types of information about the potential impacts of an airspace modernisation, project. So those might be noise contour maps, but those might not be the right things to use. So consider maybe using ways of depicting where the flight tracks may be dispersed or may be concentrated. There was a big message around making sure that the volume and the complexity of the information provided doesn't overwhelm the audience. Being aviation professionals, even though we're in the environmental part of the aviation sector, sometimes we use assumed knowledge, and that can be really disengaging. So make sure that you've got the right volume of information, but make sure you don't bamboozle people with too much complexity. Make sure you explain your terms. And actually, really important, if you can tailor your information and make it location specific. So one thing we do in my company is we use postcode search engines so that you can, when you're looking at an airspace proposal, you can go straight to where you live and understand what the local impact is. That came through as a really important way of getting people close to the information that they need about a change that's being proposed. And again, going back to that point about complexity, make sure you're communicating in a way that accords with the audience's technical understanding. Yeah, you really shouldn't assume that the audience you're talking to understands what performance-based navigation is, understands what airspace is, understands how aeroplanes use airspace and how air traffic control works. So make sure you're communicating at the right technical level. And on educational materials, the survey came through saying, we need to make sure that you've got educational materials that on the technical aspects of performance-based navigation and why these projects are being pursued. So going back to that first slide, where, what are the reasons that you're modernising this airspace? Not just because the global body for aviation says that you should, but actually, what are the benefits that you're proposing that we'll get from this modernisation? You need to provide better information on noise or emissions benefits that these projects could have for the community, and collaborate on right across the aviation stakeholder groups. So air navigation service providers, there's me using an acronym, sorry about that, air navigation service providers, the regulators, the airport operators, the airlines, all come together and actually collaborate to prepare the material. So when we found that in the survey, we found that when this work was started early and conducted often and involved all of the necessary bodies, so airlines, airports, regulators, and air traffic control, then you're most likely to mitigate community concerns, very valid concerns. If you have all of the people at the table, then people can ask the questions to the people who can give them the answers, and that's really really fundamentally important. I just wanted to talk a little bit more. As I said, quite a lot has been written about performance-based navigation, about airspace modernisation and the need for change. Airports Council International and CANSO, the trade body for air traffic control, published a document that might be of interest to those on the call back in 2014-15 about managing the impacts of aircraft noise. This for me was a really important document and is really interesting because it has a compendium of real world examples of where we've actually as an industry managed to use or deploy noise management techniques that have actually improved the quality of life for the people that are overflown by aircraft. Some more work from CANSO specifically on performance-based navigation. They've produced a best practice guide. This is a technical guide, so those who want to get into the detail and understand exactly how PBN works, how airspace modernisation works, this is the technical guide you should go to and try and understand if you want to understand a little bit more about exactly how this works. And then looking out to 2030, CANSO has also produced a concept 2030 guide, and importantly within that, this is a guide for air traffic control organisations who need to deploy performance-based navigation. Importantly, there is a specific section in this guide that is all about environment and community considerations of PBN. So bringing those right to the fore of anybody who's seeking to deploy an airspace modernisation project. And finally, and most recently, some more work between Airports Council International and CANSO as a specific document that seeks to understand how you can use performance-based navigation in order to specifically manage noise. So this talks about the benefits and challenges of performance-based navigation. It talks about the noise mitigation opportunities. It discusses the difficult area of, do you concentrate tracks or do you disperse tracks? And it also clearly talks about public engagement. In fact, that document is effectively what I've sought to do here today in order to try and explain a little bit more about what PBN and community engagement really means. So there's a very quick canter through some work that I've been doing and the industry's been doing on performance-based navigation and community engagement. I believe I'm going to pass now. I think I might be passing to John now, and I'm happy to take questions, I think, at the end.
Yes, many thanks, Ian. That was very interesting, and there are quite a lot of comments and questions about community engagement and others on concentration of noise over people. But John is going to make his presentation, and we will take the questions and comments afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
John, if you want to share your screen.
Yes, I'm just getting my screen ready, Dominique, to share it. And I think, stop. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's coming. Excellent.
Okay, well, this is really just following up Ian's presentation with a case study really on Heathrow. And but my starting point is this, I think with performance-based navigation with PBN, it's not a question of if it will be introduced, but when it will be introduced. Ian has said, there's the Global Air Navigation Plan in place. 180 states have already introduced PBN. I know there's a lot of people on the call who worry about PBN, who worry about the concentration, and who perhaps feel that they, at their airport, they can stop PBN being introduced. I've got to say, I don't think that's realistic. People may want to come back to on this point in the discussion. I don't think any major airport in the world can be an exception to a worldwide system using new technology. So for me, therefore, the question is not when it'll be introduced, not if it'll be introduced, but when it'll be introduced. And the key question following that is, if it has been introduced, how can communities benefit from it? And as I say, I want to take Heathrow as a case study. Now, what I'm not talking about today is the third runway at Heathrow. I suppose I spent about 20 years talking about the third runway at Heathrow, but I'm not talking about that today. The third runway at Heathrow is not being proceeded with right now, although it's clearly not off the agenda. But where the third runway does come into the story is the case study I'm looking at is the airspace change and the flight path changes that Heathrow was consulting on and proposing while it was actively planning for a third runway in 2018, 2019, i.e. before COVID. In the consultation, there were two steps. In step one, Heathrow asked communities what was most important to them. In other words, communities were asked to shape the consultation. They weren't presented with a variety of flight paths that they had to pick and choose from. They were asked what flight path is most important to you. And there were a number of questions, but the three basic questions were these. One, is the most important thing to fly over the fewest number of people by concentrating the flight paths over all the same areas? Or is it more important that people are given some sort of break from the noise, some sort of respite from the noise by alternating the flight paths, even though in total, the number of people overflown might rise? And the third key question was, how important is it that new areas be avoided? Now, Heathrow had over 40 consultation events. And I mean, there were arguments, which I think I would agree with, that there should have been perhaps a little bit more, because there were some areas of London, the southeast, which didn't have a consultation event. But essentially, it was a large consultation. 2.2 million leaflets were distributed, inviting people's responses. So those were the three questions. Now, Heathrow made it clear that in the questions and asking people what was most important to them in the airspace and flight path changes, it wasn't exactly a referendum, but Heathrow said that they would try and design the flight paths according to people's preferences. And if we go back to the questions, the least favored by some distance was that all flights were concentrated over the same areas. The most favored was that flight paths were alternated in order to provide respite. And it was also important to the majority of people that new areas should be avoided. So Heathrow, in drawing up their proposals drew them up according to the preferences that people expressed in the consultation. To show you, to give you an indication of what was being proposed, let me just go back to this slide, which is Heathrow's arrivals at present, how planes arrive at Heathrow. It is when a west wind is blowing, which in Britain is most of the time. So it's arriving over London. And as you can see, except for the two deep green lines around the word Hounslow, those are the final approach paths to Heathrow, to the airport. And people there, these are run at present as PBN routes. They have been since the 1970s. What happens is that until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all the planes land on one runway and on one flight path. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they all switch to the other runway and the other flight path. So people are getting extreme concentration, one plane every 90 seconds for half the day, but then for the other half, they're getting no planes at all directly overhead. And I've got to say that for people in that part of London, which is West London, this is what they appreciate. Those of you who are associated with Heathrow will know that what we call runway alternation would be fiercely opposed if that was to go. For the rest of London, as you can see, the planes are, there's no definite lines. But it does mean that particularly people in the light green areas are getting a lot of planes, up to 40 planes an hour, sometimes more. But there's no break, there's no predictable relief. And certainly when I was chairing HACAN for 20 years, the biggest single request I got in emails and in the days before emails and letters was from those areas which are light green, people wanting a predictable break from the noise, wanting respite. Now, before I go on to the next slide, it may be worth just saying for a second what respite means. The ideal respite is that when the planes are elsewhere, you don't hear any noise at all. And it would be important that if respite is introduced, it is meaningful respite. Heathrow commissioned Anderson Acoustics to do work on what meaningful respite would look like. It was the first work really done of its sort in the world. It was headed up by Nicole Porter, who's on the call today. We still haven't quite nailed down what meaningful respite would look like, but that would need to be done before PBN routes were introduced. So that was London, that's basically London before the pandemic. Now, the proposal that Heathrow was making, and remember, this is when it was planning for 3 runways, was to change significantly how planes would come in. That is London, that's the same part of London you saw before. And Heathrow divided it into several of these shapes. And everybody within each of these shapes would be guaranteed respite for at least half the day. It would probably be more than that, but it would be guaranteed for at least half the day. So that they would be PBN routes, a lot of concentration when you got them, but when you get a break, the planes wouldn't be going overhead. And that was, of course, in accordance with what the majority of people were asking for in the consultation. Now, quickly going on to departures. That's how departures were, again, pre-pandemic. Slightly different, obviously, to arrivals. There were fixed routes for departures. They weren't PBN routes, so in the sense that we're now talking about PBN, in that it wasn't route one route for a quarter of the day and then another route. The planes were fanned out across all the routes. And the proposal now, the proposal that Heathrow was making, again, departures were divided into several of these shapes. And within each of those shapes, Heathrow was saying that for departures, each area would get flights for no more than a third of the day. In other words, the planes would change twice a day. So again, there would be, you'll get a lot of planes when you got them, but there would be significant breaks for most of the day. Let me just go on to the next slide, which I'm having some difficulty. Yeah. This is my last slide. There are other measures proposed in PBN, and they are, the first one is really fairly intrinsic to PBN wherever it's introduced. PBN routes provide the potential for steeper landings and takeoffs, which means that planes will be higher for longer over communities. The other interesting point that Heathrow was looking at was linking its daytime respite periods to its nighttime respite periods, so that for most nights of the year, for certainly probably 2 weeks out of 3, people will be getting a 7-hour break from the planes during the night, which is an improvement to what we've got right now. That's more or less my presentation. As I say, I'm making an assumption, which I believe to be correct, that PBN will be coming in, that the challenge for ourselves is to try and ensure that the communities get the best possible deal from it. I know in airports where it's been introduced, particularly in the States, that has not happened. And there are our friends from the States who are on the call today. But the point of my presentation is to use this case study to try and give people some sort of hope that they can not just be involved at the later stages of a PBN proposal, but be involved in the earlier stages, helping to shape the airspace change and the flight path changes over their own communities. Dominic, that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, John. That was also very interesting, and we see that what we want, what communities want, we want to be involved at the earlier stage as possible. And often we are consulted on a project that is already drafted, and options have already been chosen. We want to be involved earlier when the options will be chosen. There are quite a lot of questions about community engagement. Some, for instance, when you talked, Ian, about Scotland, how were communities involved and when? Also about Heathrow, apparently, southeast of Heathrow was people in the southeast of Heathrow were not, or badly consulted, or were not included in the area where you could consult the impact of PBN. Maybe I will leave. There are questions from Matt Pullmans. Matt Pullmans is Matt. You will present yourself. He lives near Amsterdam. Matt, you please, if you have a question.
Yes, I'm the chairman of the residents in the Schiphol Council near Amsterdam Airport. We represent about 100 citizen organizations around the airport. And we are not consulted at all about this project of PBN. Only recently we're being told that our wish for higher landings were supposed to be combined with this PBN procedure, which means that there is going to be very strict concentration of flights. Now, first of all, I think it's unacceptable that for a large airport that the residents which are organized were not consulted at all. So that's a real question to ICAO why this wasn't done, especially since we're told now that we don't have any choice at all. We can only accept it like, and it's similar like NADP2, which was forced upon us in the area of start procedures. Almost the same. We couldn't talk about if and how it was implemented. It just was forced upon us. So that's really a problem. And I'm talking about 10, 20, 30,000 residents which have suffer by the growth of Schiphol Airport. And so my first question is, why were we not consulted at all?
Well, it's difficult to answer for Schiphol Airport or for the ANSPs in the Netherlands. I don't think we have any official representation of airport or ANSP here, except from for NATS in the UK. Indeed,
Dominic, it may be worth saying that what's happened in the UK, Matt, if we go back some years, the consultation procedures were not good. An example of that was at London City Airport, where flight paths were changed with minimal consultation, and PBN routes were brought in. There was a fuss about that. I think there was also a fuss about Gatwick. And as a result of that, the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK brought in more than guidelines, brought in instructions as to what airports needed to do in order to consult at an early stage. Now, I think Heathrow probably, I mean, I know from the CAA they regarded Heathrow as consultation of the third runway as their golden boy was the term they used, but it could have been a golden girl as well. But essentially the CAA guidelines and instructions have made sure that residents need to be consulted at an early stage. And if they're not properly consulted, the CAA will not accept the new routes. They turn down routes in, for example, Edinburgh. 3 times Edinburgh Airport had to consult. 3 times they were turned down. And at least on 2 of the occasions, I believe, it was because they hadn't consulted properly. So I think that's what's driving the change in the UK. I suspect in the Netherlands and perhaps in other countries, you don't have that. But as I say, I can't speak for the Netherlands, but I think that was the big change in the UK.
Okay, well, John, we know one another, so I quite agree that you could do it for the UK. But since I'm talking for the Netherlands, the question is, what does Uecna have a position on this forced procedure, which is very strange because it distributes, as you said, distribution of flight paths or concentration is concentration of noise, and we have the debate in the Netherlands about concentration or distribution of the for the people who suffer. Well, 2 questions. Does Uecna have a position on it? And secondly, who should we talk to, or if we want to be consulted before this is introduced? Schiphol Airport tells the same story. It's forced on us, and we don't accept it.
I mean, I think there's two things there. Uecna actually have a position on PBN as such. I think Uecna has a general position, Matt, about residents, whatever the change, should be consulted at the earliest possible stage, as Dominic said. In fact, we want to be engaged even more than consulted. Yeah. I think my feeling about yourselves in the Netherlands is this is probably, if Schiphol won't move on this, and Schiphol is the dominant airport in the Netherlands, obviously, yeah. But if Schiphol won't move on this, I think it needs lobbying of the Dutch government. They need to ensure that something like the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority procedures in the UK, are brought in, which require airports to consult in a much better way.
Well, we have quite a sophisticated system in the Netherlands of consultation and a long history, as you know. Presently, we are redesigning these procedures, but this major point of PBN, it's a major change in the way of running the airport. I think, moreover, most airports are talking about 2 lanes, and you are talking about a third. In the Netherlands, we already have 6 lanes, and also a little possibility of our own Gatwick being introduced. So the distribution of noise is a major topic, which at present is being talked about. And we're only told recently that PBN is going to be forced upon us. Well, we don't accept it.
No, okay. As I say, we probably do need to move on. But as I say, I think you probably need to lobby the government, and maybe this is the time when they're looking again at the wider consultation points. Okay. But I see some other hands up.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Bertold, do you want to take the floor? You had a question.
Thank you. I'm from Germany, Vice President of the German Association Against Aircraft Noise, and also member of the Commission Against Aircraft Noise at the Frankfurt Airport. I think you must differentiate between 2 kinds of dispersion and concentrating. The first is it good or not good to concentrate the airplanes on an existing path, or is it good to concentrate the traffic at all? I think in Frankfurt it is meaningful to concentrate the traffic on an existing part. It is good to concentrate on the part. We have many flight procedures where the middle of the path is between residential areas. And if a plane leaves this part, you have much more noise annoying. And we had some years ago large problems with the B7478, which have a very poor FPM, which leaves the normal path and flow over residential areas, and we could solve the problem with a PBN procedure with RF lags. And since we have in this residential areas much less noise, and it is a very other question if to introduce new procedures using PBN, and then you have in every case or very often the problem of new annoyed people. Another issue we actually discuss in Frankfurt. PBN is an issue in Frankfurt, and there is a rumor that if existing procedures will be redesigned using PBN, they will become worse. As far as we know, the limits for the bank angels close to the airports were drastically reduced by ICAO, and so you have less possibilities to optimize flight path, and I would be happy if somebody could say something to this issue.
Thank you, Bertold. Ian, do you want to say a word?
In terms of the bank angles, Bertold, I'm not aware of any particular changes. What my airspace design people tell me is that actually performance-based navigation improves somewhat the ability to or the flexibility you have in where you put your routes. The bank angle thing I'm not aware of. It may well be it may well be that is the case. Your local procedure designers would probably be, more well placed to advise on that. But my understanding is that actually PBN gives you more flexibility, not less flexibility.
Thank you, Ian. Robert, you had a question? We can't hear you.
Yeah, I just wanted to put a different view to.
Sorry, Robert. Well, just say for the benefit of everyone.
I'm Robert Buick. I live around Heathrow, and I've been involved since we were subjected to the 2014 PBN flights out of Heathrow. No consultation whatsoever. Those trials were abandoned 3 months early because of the huge political outcry, or huge outcry, and the huge political fallout. And at that point in time, Heathrow was a neighbour that I barely knew about. Obviously, I knew they were there. I very occasionally used the airport, but from that point on, I got engaged in campaigning against aircraft noise, because if this was what's going to be coming in the future, we needed to we need to influence that where these flight paths are going. Now, as far as I understand where Berthold is coming from and concentrating on existing flight paths, but departure routes which is where I'm particularly affected by. The SIDs typically have an area around them called NPRs, which are 3 kilometers wide. Well, today the aircraft, effectively run down the SID, basically. So they run down the same flight path all the time, which gives us concentrated flight paths. Now, if PBN were given PBN were used and they could make them do the same sort of thing as the original noise preference routes, which are 3 kilometers wide, that would be an acceptable outcome. But it's not what is convenient for the industry, and they're happy to just take all the benefits, and they take out of our noise budget essentially. Now, we've been going on at this for a long time, and the industry is, here's what we're saying. We just hope that when it is put through, and we are currently consulting on airspace changes out of Heathrow. One of those is a departure route on the Compton, where the flight paths, the typical flight paths, were something of 10 kilometers wide, because they never get to the noise preference routes. Now, if they were to concentrate those flight paths to one single PBN route, we're talking about a 1,500 to 1 concentration. Now that is as the CAA said, living in a noise sewer, and we that is just totally unacceptable, and we would fight that as far as we could. So that's my point. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. I'm not sure there was a question here, more a statement.
What I would suggest is take a few points, Dominic, and then we can perhaps come back.
John?
The other John, yes.
John Doherty?
Good afternoon, or hello everyone. I'm based in Southeast London, and we cooperate and collaborate with a number of local authorities in the areas around Lewisham. John and I and Tim Walker have had many conversations over the fact that in our particular area, we have to endure 2 significant areas of overflight. We are double overflown by aircraft at a very low level from London Heathrow, and at an even lower flight path level for a single route PBN, which was laid out before us and enforced upon us by London City Airport. Ian, this is perhaps more directed at a comment that you made. I think that in the UK, we have been very fortunate. We've got the CAP 1616 process in action now, which lays out gateway processes in which we are nominally engaged in at least some consultation. But the introduction of good principles into good quality design is not deployed consistently. We've got some very good examples emerging from London Heathrow, where we can see some fair levels of distribution which provide significant quantums of respite around us. But London City Airport, even using the 1616 process, has actually almost universally, completely unilaterally, ignored the importance of seeing some good quality elements introduced so that we see some genuine flight dispersal and at levels where we're using good principles such as CDA. At London City Airport, for example, we have to endure a 22-kilometre fixed level flight at 2,000 feet over our rooftops with no CDA being employed, and consequently the noise levels from that area, from that airport alone, is very significant. And that's before we get into the complexities of having to endure the noise from London Heathrow. So I simply wanted to make the point here, and I think it's important from the examples that we can witness here in the UK, that operators who are engaging in consultation processes have actually got to listen to the messages that are being provided to them using some fairly robust processes that at least we hoped would deliver better outcomes for us. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yes, you're quite right.
Did you want me to respond to that, Dominique?
Yes, if you want. Yes, of course.
I mean, John, I think I probably agree. I mean, one of the reasons we did the work through ICAO, actually involving, I've been looking in the chat, involving actually the International Coalition on Sustainable Aviation. So, Dominique was involved in that. One of the reasons we did that was to understand, well, actually what works and what doesn't work. Where has it not gone? Where has it not gone well? And we did look at airports around the world where it's possibly not, a good process hasn't necessarily been followed, and you can learn you can learn from that. And that's why we produced this good practice guide, because it could be picked up by anybody that's looking at changing airspace and understand in really simple terms what works. And I think John, sorry, the other John, set out very clearly was how Heathrow Airport have done, looked at those principles and deployed them, I think quite successfully. I just wanted to respond to, there was something in the chat. Richard H was talking about that the airports don't have any influence on where the routes are. In the UK, that's not the case. So in the UK, NATS, as the en route air navigation service provider, we are responsible for the routes above 7,000 feet, right up to cruise level, and the individual airports are responsible for the route designs below. Now, clearly, we need to make them, but fit together. So we have a very keen interest in where the airports are going to put their routes, and they follow CAP 1616, that process, as do we. And actually, the coordination of all of those airport plans is the job of ACOG, the Airspace Change Organising Group. So it's actually a joint, kind of joint, but actually it's the airports that are responsible for the lower level positioning of routes. And there is other legislation that dictates that there are certain levels above and below which noise is the primary concern, and then above, there's levels above which emissions should be the primary concern. So broadly speaking, up to 4,000 feet, noise is the absolute primary consideration. Between 4,000 and 7,000, noise is an important consideration, unless it's significantly detrimentally impacts on emissions, and then above 7,000 feet, emissions tends to be the priority. So I hope that clarifies those points for you.
Thank you, Ian. I'm quite happy because there's many questions about community engagement and how should we be involved, and this will be the topic of our next webinar. So I think there's a lot to be said here. Nigel, if you're from Heathrow, raise your hand. And no, you're not.
No, Nigel's from no, he's not from Heathrow. He's from the UK, but not Heathrow.
Okay, Nigel, could you just wait a minute before I take your question? I will ask Giulio to take the floor because it's good to have people from other areas than just the UK. I know our speakers were both British, but Giulio from Bologna.
Yes. Okay. I'm just want to ask to Ian Jobson, what do you think about the noise guidelines from World Health Organization? Does the PBN procedures aim to cut down the noise step by step, as the noise guidelines of the World Health Organization requires, which are 40 dBA in the night and 45 dBA in all the day, 24 hours. We have to be pragmatic about this, I think. What do you think?
Thank you, Juliet. It's a good question. I watched very closely as the World Health Organization guidelines were revealed, and I think certainly through some colleagues, some research colleagues, and through ICAO, there were some questions about the achievability of those targets. Certainly, ICAO. I don't believe ICAO was involved in that work, and I have heard, and I have to say, it's in a level of technical detail that's slightly beyond me. I have heard some say that there's parts of that study that perhaps aren't quite as robust as they might be. I'm not saying I'm not saying the study's wrong. I'm just saying people in ICAO and elsewhere in the research community have brought those into question. But I do think those targets are, well, they're not targets, they're guidelines that we should seek to go after. Now, I don't think they're achievable. I think what the industry is trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to reduce the noise impacts as far as we possibly could. So there's quite a subtle difference there. So, for example, in what John Stewart's been talking about respite and things like that, actually in respite terms, you might not reduce the absolute noise level. You might restrict the noise level to a certain part of the day and give people peace and quiet for the rest of the day. Now, you might actually, that might be valued more than just reducing the noise level for everybody. And somebody put in the chat, it was a really good question, is it better to annoy one person 24 hours or 24 people 1 hour? So for me, absolute noise levels are important, but noise management and managing the impacts of noise, I think, are as important. I'm sure you're aware there's a really large study, cross-European study called ANIMA, which is feeding out actually next month, which is about the non-acoustic influences of aircraft noise. And many studies find that perhaps more than 30% of people's reaction to noise, it doesn't relate necessarily to the decibel level. It relates to their perception of it, the fairness of it, and all of those sorts of things. So I think absolutely the World Health Organization has a place to set guidelines for aircraft noise, as it does for other transportation modes, absolutely, and all sorts of environmental noise. But I don't think it's the full story, because I think there's the non-acoustic effects to bear in mind, and there's the noise impact rather than the absolute noise level.
We're arriving at the end of our meeting. Nigel, you had a question, and maybe this will be the last question.
Thank you. I joined campaigning following an airspace change that was made at Luton Airport in 2016, concentrated flight path, I live about 16 miles from a runway, and previously the aircraft were well dispersed when they came over this area, and it wasn't an issue. The aircraft were concentrated. In their wisdom, they decided to put the route between two communities, which sounds like a good idea. It's very easy with PBN to draw a line on a map and say, this is where the aircraft will fly. And of course, that's where they are flying. But it's not solved the problem for either community, because they both hear all the aircraft. The only difference is that some of them hear them louder than others, but they're still there. And the point I wanted to make really was that, yes, how loud they are is a factor, but there is also the constant repetitive dripping tap of the noise, even when you are some way off to one side of the flight path. You suddenly become aware of every aircraft, which didn't happen when we had dispersion. Thank you.
Dominic, you're on mute.
Sorry. Do you want to answer that, or?
No, I don't think so. Eleftheria's got her hand up there.
Eleftheria, I think you will be the last one to speak, and I'll conclude.
Okay, I just wanted to ask both John and Ian, because there was an interesting question which summarizes all. Given your experience, what is the worst? Is the question that Michael raised? What is at the end the worst? One person disturbed for 24 hours or 25 people disturbed for 1 hour?
My own personal view is the worst is one person disturbed for 24 hours, because you're putting it on all the noise on a minority of people, and certainly I don't think that's fair. If it can be avoided, I think we try and avoid that by looking towards meaningful respite, and I also think that, you know, and as Ian hinted at this as well, and I think there's been some hints in the community in the chat, that for most people, it's not the number of flights in total that's using an airport that is necessarily the problem. It's the number of flights which are going over their particular community in a particular day, in a particular week. And I think if we can use PBN to restrict and limit the number of flights going over particular communities by offering respite, then that's probably the way forward. So, Michael, I think I would say it's definitely avoid one person getting it 24 hours a day. I don't know what Ian thinks.
Ian.
I love democracy, so I think I would probably ask the 24 people to give their views as to what's the right solution. Then you might get 24 different answers, which is a problem. But if you don't ask, then you're not gonna understand what the right solution is. I think it's wrong to impose a solution without asking.
Yeah.
The bigger problem is that we're not asked at all.
Yes. So I think we're coming to arriving at the end of this meeting, and there's a lot in the chat, and really not many people took the floor, but there's a lot of comments in the chat, and really the fear of concentrated flight path, it creates hell, and I'm not going to be very politically correct. Michele raised it, and others in the chat. Concentration of noise is not acceptable over people. Unless we buy out people, and even then there will be air pollution and climate impact. I can't see how it is acceptable when the noise guideline of the WHO are very strict about noise, especially at night, but also during the day. 45 LDN is quite low, and you won't reach it with a concentration of flight path. I think reduction of flight could be a solution. I must say that in France, we just filed a petition with the European Parliament about asking for a moratorium on the expansion of airports until the problem of noise and the environmental noise directive and the balanced approach studies are being made and become efficient, which is not the case today, because at airports, the noise is far above 45 LDN. So I would like to end on these words and thoughts for Ian maybe, and the administrations and aviation authorities. You have seen that, in fact, people in the chat are very much opposed to PBN. I really don't know anyone who benefits from PBN, apart from those who are relieved from flight paths to the detriment of others. I'm sure that sometimes you can draw a specific flight path to avoid communities, and then there is benefit. Or if there are very little inhabitants in the area, but really in vastly, very heavily densely populated area, it's very difficult to implement a concentration of flight path without affecting people's health.